Polls weren't even closed in New Hampshire. One candidate actually left that state to focus on a race that will likely make or break his campaign. Joe Biden, as Steve just mentioned, clearly aware he was not going to fare well last night. He was on the ground in South Carolina as the results rolled in.
I've been coming here a long time. We just heard from the first 2 of 50 states. 2 of them. Not all the nation, not half the nation, not a quarter of the nation, not 10%, 2. You can't be the Democratic nominee and you can't win a general election as Democrat unless you have overwhelming support from black and brown voters. It's just really simple.
All right, let's talk about that. I want to bring in South Carolina Congressman Jim Clyburn. He is also the House Majority Whip. Congressman, always a pleasure, sir. Thanks for your time. An accurate headline could read, Bernie wins, Amy surges and surprises. Black and brown voters now start casting their primary ballots. How do you expect this race in your state, in our state? How do you expect the race in South Carolina and Nevada? How do you expect it to change this Democratic race?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Craig. Well, first of all, I do believe that these 2 states will change the trajectory quite a bit. I don't know exactly how. I think Amy Klobuchar demonstrated last night that she's a viable candidate. I think that Bernie and Pete both have demonstrated that over the last 2 weeks. The fact of the matter is, though, you have to look at the demographics of the electorate. And the fact of the matter is, the African-American vote, the Hispanic vote, these voters are going to begin to show up this coming Saturday and then the following Saturday. Yeah. And I think when those 2 races are over, we'll get some definition.
Congressman,
yes?
you just mentioned Amy Klobuchar. You just mentioned Mayor Pete. You didn't mention Joe Biden there. And I wonder if that was, are you at all concerned that the vice president has lost his mojo?
No, I'm not concerned that he has lost it. I think that what has happened with Joe's campaign is that he has not projected out into the future the way people would like for him to do. So I just think that he is still, as of this moment, the leading candidate in South Carolina. I think Steyer is doing well in South Carolina. And so I do believe that as we go into South Carolina, it is a five-way contest right now.
Let's talk about Tom Steyer for a moment. I'm glad you brought him up because a number of friends and family members have told me that you can't turn on a TV or a radio or get online in South Carolina without seeing or hearing an ad from Tom Steyer. And some big news for him this morning. He just named an influential state lawmaker, someone that you've known for a number of years, Representative Gilda Cobb Hunter, as an advisor to his campaign. She says that he has the broadest appeal to voters across the country. How likely are Tom Steyer's chances to win in South Carolina or to even come in the top 2 or 3 there in South Carolina?
Well, it's still 2 weeks to go. And so the chances are great that he could get into the top tier. Now, I don't know if it's that 1, 2, or 3, but I doubt very seriously if the election were held today that he would win. I doubt very seriously that he would come in second place right now. I don't know what will happen in 2 weeks from now because I think Nevada will have some impact on how South Carolinians look at these candidates.
You think South Carolina voters want to see someone who comes out of Nevada that's electable? Let's talk about Michael Bloomberg here for a moment. I would imagine that you've heard the audio that surfaced yesterday of Mayor Bloomberg talking about stop and frisk. Did that change your perception of Michael Bloomberg as a viable presidential candidate for the Democratic nomination?
Well, I know Michael Bloomberg. We have interacted over the last several years since I became Majority Whip the first time I've been in and out of New York and with his news organization, so I know him. He's been to South Carolina. He's been supportive of my candidacy. I like him as a person. I do believe, though, he will have one heck of a challenge trying to overcome the stop and frisk, because that was a very, very racially charged policy that I think he's going to have a hard time overcoming. Now, I know, love, respect Steve Benjamin. And Steve Benjamin has told me that he's had conversations with Bloomberg that satisfies him, that he's regretful of the policy, that he was a bit flippant in describing it at times, and he's apologized for it. And Steve says he is comfortable with that apology. And I've always been very comfortable with Steve Benjamin.
I know. Steve Benjamin, of course, the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, who's also the national co-chair of Michael Bloomberg's campaign. Really quickly, Congressman, we're almost out of time. Iowa and New Hampshire, should they still be the first two states that kick off the nominating contest for your party?
Absolutely not. And I've been saying that for over 20 years. When we started this so-called pre-primary window, that came about in order to get South Carolina and Nevada into the mix before we get too far down the road. And as you know, the legislatures in New Hampshire and in Iowa kept moving their caucus and their primary up in order to be the first caucus and the first primary. It is time for our party to say to both those states, you are not going to be first unless you change significantly the demographics of your state. That's not going to happen, so we need to take action to make sure that all of the people that we depend upon to help win in November have some say-so in the spring.
Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. Congressman, thank you. I'll see you in a few weeks.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.